Hi, I am Peggy Rosario, and I thank you for viewing this presentation on using inclusive strategies to create a successful final project. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Business and Education at Gwynedd Mercy University, and I teach in an EDD program with an emphasis on teaching and learning. One of the things that I really enjoy integrating into my classes is a final project allows my students to synthesize their learning and really demonstrate that understanding through the project. So I hope that you've come to this session to learn either about what a final project could involve, or if you're already implementing a final project, to get some ideas that can help you enhance it. So the description for this session is final course projects can enable students to demonstrate their learning in a meaningful way. This session will provide a variety of strategies to create or revise a final project to increase its effectiveness and inclusiveness. Strategies covered include the following: backward design, chunking, feedback, and engagement. The research behind these practices, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion, will be emphasized. So the outcomes that I hope you can achieve by viewing this presentation are utilize backward design to implement a final project around SLOs. Deconstruct a final project into chunks that are implemented throughout a course. Integrate feedback and engagement strategies that help students enhance their final project. And finally, design, feedback, and engagement strategies support diversity, equity, and inclusion. The first component that I want to discuss is backward design. This was really articulated by Wiggins and McTeague in their book, Understanding by Design. And I think their idea of starting with identifying outcomes should resonate strongly with everybody that's attending this conference. So the first step is to say outcomes that you hope to achieve in your final project. And I should mention, if you open the attachment that includes my PowerPoint presentation, I have a link in the title of the presentation. Let me just go back 2 slides to show that. This is hyperlinked to a Google document that provides a worksheet that will enable you to go through each of the steps of the components that we are discussing related to creating a final project. So when it comes to identifying outcomes, thinking about what do you hope the students will achieve in this final project. One of the nice things about final projects is they tend to allow you to incorporate a number of different outcomes. So being able to make the link between what you hope students will accomplish in the course and what they'll accomplish in the project is very important. The next part of backward design is selecting assessment methods. So rather than going right to learning strategies, you next think about, how can I make sure that students have demonstrated their ability to meet the outcomes? So that's the purpose of doing the assessment methods next. They're directly linked to your outcomes. And then the last thing that you do is you develop those learning strategies that will enable the students to produce the content that is needed to demonstrate they're meeting that outcome. So this is what we call backward design. Some of you might be doing this intuitively. Some of you, I'm assuming everybody is starting with the outcomes, but the idea of starting with outcomes and then moving to assessments might be a little bit different than you're used to approaching it. But it makes sense, because if you don't know how to be assessed, you don't truly know how to develop those learning strategies. Because, for example, let's say the assessment is to describe something. You need to make sure that the students have enough content and learning to be able to effectively describe what you want them to describe. So that's why the learning strategies come last, because they're designed specifically around how the students will be developing and I should say not developing, but demonstrating their understanding. I have a hyperlink at the bottom here to the Understanding by Design website that is produced by Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching. This is a wonderful place to learn more about what Understanding by Design is. If you don't want to read the whole book, it includes videos, outlines, and general information that can really help you implement this backward design model. So again, we start with identifying outcomes. If you take the project worksheet attachment and think about what is your project and what outcomes do you want to meet, you can fill those in as a good starting point to help begin to build what you're going to require the students to do. So the next thing I wanted to do is share some research, I should say resources that can help you enhance your ability to implement the backward design model. So when it comes to writing objectives, I include information about Georgia Tech's Developing Student Learning Outcomes Statements, wonderful resource that can give you some good overview information, and then Indiana University's Learning Outcomes Generator. This is an interactive tool that enables you to be able to articulate through a series of questions how you want to state the learning outcomes. So it's very helpful in giving you some concrete choices and allowing you to build effective learning outcomes, because if you don't have a strong learning outcome to start, it's really hard to build an effective project to meet that outcome. So you want to be clear, you want to be specific, you want to understand at what level you want the students to demonstrate their learning, and you want to make it, I said clear, but I think that is the most important thing, that when you read it, you can understand what it means and be able to envision how students will demonstrate that learning. Some other resources I wanted to share relate to the assessment step. The University of Tennessee at Chattanooga has a very comprehensive webpage on classroom assessment that can give you some helpful ideas. And then related to supporting the instruction step, interestingly, the USDA offers suggested instructional strategies to use with each level of Bloom's taxonomy. So kind of an unexpected source, but incredibly helpful. So if you're using a particular action word within Bloom's taxonomy, it includes a list of different strategies that would work well to help students meet that particular assessment strategy. One thing that I can't emphasize enough with backward design is the idea of layering that with universal design for learning. The reason why that's so important is that UDL supports diverse learning needs. Some of the ways that you can implement that would be giving students a choice of their project topic so that each student is picking something that's meaningful to them. That really helps support the idea of multiple means of engagement. Students who choose their topic tend to be drawn in because it's something they're interested in. Another idea is including a variety of learning strategies, and that relates to the UDL guideline of multiple means of representation. So what that means is that students are learning about the different pieces that go into their final project, giving them options beyond just reading the textbook, beyond the classroom lecture. Are there videos? Are there websites? Are there journal articles? What are these supplemental ways that they can learn that help make that learning meaningful? The other idea is what are different learning modalities that can be integrated? For example, is there ways to make the learning embodied? Can they use their bodies to really kinesthetically embrace the understanding of what they're learning? Can they use language and symbols? Can they use different vocabulary words that really deepen the meaning of the learning for them? So looking at a variety of learning strategies is a really critical part of the design process. In my teaching, I really try to embrace universal design for learning in as many ways as I can. So providing choices to my students is really important when it comes to completing assignments. When it comes to instruction, I always try to make sure I have a reading, a video, or a podcast, supplemental resources on particular aspects. I will do announcements for the course that give students some tips. If I see people are having a lack of understanding of a particular topic, I will use a course announcement to help reinforce that, as well as share additional resources. In discussion forums, I teach predominantly online, and I will pop into a discussion to help provide additional information, ask questions to get students thinking differently about a topic. So that multiple means of representation comes in many ways, and we'll talk more about that and how it relates to your project later. And then finally is multiple means of action and expression. So that relates to how do the students present their learning? When you think about a project, in a final course project, in many cases, it could be a research paper. But does it have to be a research paper? Could it be a recorded video presentation? Could it be a live presentation in school? Could students make a video? Could they, create a game or something? I mean, the bottom line is you want them to demonstrate learning related to the outcome, but does it have to be in one particular modality? And I really encourage you to provide options, because students, when they're able to choose the modality that they're most comfortable with, it really allows them to shine. They're more engaged, they're more excited about the learning, and they tend to dig deeper because they're doing something that they really want. So I encourage you to check out the UDL guidelines and a graphic that describes all of the details behind each of these areas. I find them incredibly helpful in creating a deeper learning for students when I'm designing courses in general, but also with the final project too. What I want to do throughout the presentation is show some parallels between the techniques and strategies I'm sharing and some best practices for inclusive education. So the book that I'm going to share strategies from is called What Inclusive Instructors Do: Principles and Practices for Excellence in College Teaching, by Addy, Dube, Mitchell, and SoRelle. I encourage you to check out this book. It is a really interesting read with some very helpful examples. And what I've done is just pulled some sample quotes that show how the strategies I'm suggesting relate to the best practices that they have found. So the first one is, by allowing students to choose the topic of the project, you support incorporating resonant course material. So what really rings true for these students makes the learning meaningful and it engages them. The second point is, including multiple modalities of learning provides students with a great opportunity to succeed, since everyone has different learning needs. I think that's an important thing to remember related to universal design for learning, and creating that backward design project that includes choices with it. The next piece that I want to talk about is chunking content. And this can be done in many different ways. When I presented on this topic before, sometimes people get over and they think, oh my gosh, I have to do a million different things to create this successful final project. And my response to that is no. What I encourage you to do is think about creating a few chunks. See how it works. And then if you feel like students would benefit by additional breakdowns of the content, move forward and make that revision in the future. But the idea behind chunking content at the most basic level is to think about ways that students can produce something related to the final project that builds upon each piece and allows them to have a more successful final piece. So at the most basic level, having them pick a topic. One of the things that often happens with the final project is if students don't commit to that project topic early, at the end, they're scrambling because they haven't thought about it and they haven't done anything about it. So if you have an assignment early in the course where the students are discussing what the topic will be for their final project, it's to begin that engagement. Another strategy is to have them submit a draft, perhaps 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on how long your course is. My courses are only 7 weeks long, so we do the draft a week before. But putting out the draft allows the student to begin to pull things together, and it allows you as the instructor to help give them feedback where they might be falling short in certain areas. And then the final project would be their final submission. So that is a very basic approach: topic, draft, final. Another final project might be related to a research paper. I taught the equivalent of a freshman seminar course in an accelerated format over 5 weeks. And when you see these blocks, that was basically what we did each week. In addition to learning other content, I had the students pick their research paper topic in the first week. In the second week, they did a literature review in the form of an annotated bibliography. So they were forced to find sources related to their topic. In the third week, I had them outline what their literature showed. So they began to form that structure of the paper. The next to last week, I had them do the draft where they put the substance in, but I could give them that feedback for refinement. And then the final week, they submitted their final paper. So this is a very helpful approach in giving students the opportunity to focus on small pieces that then move into the big project. What I call an advanced chunking model would be just like the other one, starting with a topic, but then thinking about what are multiple parts. And it could just be one additional part that you're having the students complete before the draft, and then you end with the final. I'll give you an example of how I made this work for an instructional design class that I taught. So the topic of their final project was the topic of the course that they were going to design. So they could pick any type of course. So the first week they had to focus on that. Then they had to, in subsequent weeks, focus on who is the audience, what are the outcomes, how do the outcomes link together. I had them, I actually, in my design of the course, forced them to do backward design. So we did the outcomes first, then we did the assessment strategies, and then after that, we did the instructional strategies. So each week, they had the opportunity to identify these different pieces and pull them together in preparation for making that draft the week before the final was due. And the way I had them share their draft was in kind of an overview, a PowerPoint overview, or a video if they chose, because I like to give them choices to enable them to show their peers what the different parts were. And that gave me the chance to give them feedback as well before they did their final project. So I'm curious for you to think about what chunks either currently exist in a project that you're doing or could exist in a project you're doing, or that you want to plan, rather. Perhaps you already have a couple chunks in the project that you're working on with your students, but you're finding that in one particular area, students are struggling a bit. That could be a sign that you need to add an additional chunk. Take more time on that particular piece, give them opportunities for feedback and engagement, which we'll talk about in a moment, to really enhance that part of the learning. So one of the things that I love about this model is it can really be dynamic. In each time you teach the course, you learn more about how the students approach the project, and where they struggle is a sign that you need to provide more instruction, perhaps more feedback around a particular piece, so you can make revisions down the road. So how does this relate to what inclusive instructors do? Inclusive instructors embrace learner-centered approaches in their teaching. Learner-centered instruction focuses on helping students acquire knowledge, skills, and attitudes to meet learning goals. Embrace mindset mean providing opportunities for students to fail forward during their learning journey. This is so incredibly important. When we talk about the feedback piece, it gives them a chance to fail. And that is so important to their being able to make enhancements and build that strong, successful final project. In this model, each chunk allows the student to work on a piece of the final project and improve it for the final submission. So before we go on to strategies for engagement and feedback, I'd like you to consider, if you have the worksheet in front of you, what are some chunks that you could build into your course project? Think about what's working well, what's challenging. You know, sometimes the biggest challenge with projects is just getting students to work on them before the last minute. So if you're able to build in some deliverables earlier in the course that force them to begin thinking about it, that in and of itself will strengthen the final product, because students aren't just throwing together at the end. All right, moving on to the engagement and feedback piece. There are a number of different ways that you can approach engagement and feedback: student to student, student to teacher, and teacher to student. I want to start off by talking about the student to student aspect. There are a number of ways that you can integrate this, as you can see in the yellow arrows going both ways. One example is discussions. If you're teaching a live class, you can have a full class discussion. You can have discussion groups, discussion pairs, but talking about what they're doing related to the course project can allow students to develop deeper thinking, to learn from the struggles of their peers, and really make some enhancements, because they're learning about aspects of their project that they never considered before. I teach online, and one of the things that I'll have students do is post in a discussion, share, for example, your course outcomes. And that way, students can see what their peers' outcomes are. They can give each other feedback. For example, if a particular outcome doesn't seem to be measurable, or it might seem a little basic for the type of project that the student is describing, students can give each other feedback about that. Putting themselves in the seat of, if I was a student and this is what I had to experience when I'm teaching my instructional design course, would it work for me? Would I understand? Would I be able to carry it out? So they can react both from the peer aspect, but also from the student aspect in the course that I teach. And it's really helpful too when I chime in the discussion and I ask a question and I spur their thinking, because peers can learn from how I'm helping their peers as well. But we'll talk more about teacher to student in a bit later. Peer editing is another opportunity where students can work together in partners or even in a group to share what they're working on and provide specific feedback. Now, I work with doctoral students who are already teachers, so peer editing is something that comes naturally for them because as teachers, they're editing their students' work all of the time. However, novice students, undergraduate students, may not have any experience or comfort with peer editing. So you really have to look at the audience and decide, is this strategy something that they can just jump into? Is it something that I need to really provide them a lot of scaffolding to understand? How do you look at someone else's work? How do you provide feedback? One of the things that I like to do is have students answer specific questions when they're reviewing their peers' work. For example, what did they really enjoy or find effective? What did they find confusing? What questions do they have about what the student is sharing? So in answering those specific questions, it really gives them a frame, and it's a positive frame. It's not nitpicky, right? It's like helping them see the good and clear up what might be a little bit confusing. And then the final option for engagement and feedback between students would be group work. Like peer editing, sometimes people are ready to jump into groups and they can do it effectively. Other times they really need some guidance and development in how to be an effective group member. In some groups, students will jump to the lead and kind of dominate and not allow other students to participate. Some students naturally hang back and don't really contribute. So there are challenges to group work, but depending on the level of the student's experience in working with groups, this is something that can certainly be developed with them through some scaffolding. And when you think about almost any workplace, group work is critical. Giving feedback, receiving feedback is something that will be part of probably everybody's work life. So being able to develop these skills in the classroom can really help build those skills and help the students learn better, not only for the project, but for life. So when I teach my instructional design class, I will have students, I focus mostly on the discussion piece so that they will post drafts of their work in the discussion. Their peers will give feedback, and then I will have them submit a revised product based on the feedback that they receive from their peers. And I will also jump in and share some feedback as needed. So being able to get that feedback, you're not designing this project in isolation. It is, supported not only by your peers' feedback, but also by observing what your peers are doing and getting ideas about how they're approaching it. So this is an incredibly important strategy. Another strategy is student to faculty. This involves ways that the student can communicate to the faculty member how they're experiencing the content, how the work that they're doing along the way is going well or not so well for them. Each week, I have my students do a reflection journal. And part of that is asking them to discuss what's working well related to planning their project, what's challenging, what questions they have. And I have to say that this was completely the thing that made a difference in one of the instructional design classes I taught. I had a student who was producing good work, Like, I would have never known what was going on inside her head without that reflection journal, where she told me that she was feeling really insecure, didn't feel like she had, the grounding or the ability to do it. Whereas I was looking at her work as perfectly fine. So being able to get that kind of feedback allowed me to then take the next step of the one-on-one and say, hey, let's talk about how things are going, and just really give her that reassurance. So students telling faculty what their experience is, either in writing through a reflection journal, or if you're looking at UDL, you could have them do a reflection video, reflection audio, whatever it is that they are sharing their experience and how they are, working through the pieces of the project is really, really important. When you look at, success, right? Success of the final project, it's not just what they're producing, it's how they feel about what they're producing. And this reflection and meeting really supports the feeling side of things, because students can feel very insecure, even though things are looking okay. And if you're able to give them that reassurance and that confidence, their mental anguish of going through the process is greatly reduced. And when you consider all of the stresses in people's lives, being able to provide that gift to students is really, really important. The last component then is faculty relating back to students with feedback and engagement. So I've mentioned this numerous times already. I just couldn't help myself in talking about the other components of the model. So feedback in my classes happens in many different, we're online. I will pop into the discussion and provide responses to students' work. I will give them feedback in weekly announcements. I'll make some general observations about things I'm seeing related to the work in the projects, and I will provide them grading feedback. So let's move on to the grading piece. One of the things that can work really well with assessing the chunks throughout the project plan is to think about ungrading. Might there be an opportunity where students get full credit for just putting something out there along the way, and then it's just the final project that has that qualitative assessment? The important thing, if you decide not to deduct points for problems along the way, is to give feedback, or that audio feedback, or that video feedback that lets them know what's working well, what's challenging, that they're not quite where they need to be, and what are some suggestions for enhancement. So the number one thing for grading isn't necessarily the letter or the number, it is that substantive feedback. You can provide it related to assignments, within assignments, in the case of discussions. If you're teaching live and you have a class discussion, you can provide the feedback in, as part of that live discussion. You can provide grading feedback in the grade book, but it's the feedback that is so incredibly important to really allow students to use that to make improvements in their project. So how does this relate to what inclusive instructors do? First point is that they include, or I should say they incorporate perspectives by having the students learn from each other. This, I have to say, is a priceless feature of using the course project chunks and having the students see each other's work. Some people can feel a little intimidated by it, but if you create the environment in the class that we're all learning, and the way I designed this process is to give everybody a chance to fail, to try it out, figure out what's not working, and make improvements. And that, as I mentioned before, it's like that growth mindset that the goal is to really make incremental improvements. It's not to be perfect. And that can really create a sense of comfort in your class. Next, they promote student engagement. So having the students talk with each other, review each other's work, give each other feedback, them working together. It removes that sense of isolation that they're learning, alone without having that input. And in the work world, we often collaborate with each other and learn from each other. So that mimics what happens in real life. Next, they set expectations for success in this model by allowing students to work on refining each piece of the final project. So by having these chunks along the way, students submit them, they get feedback, they can refine them, and then integrate them better into the final project. The next point is they provide resources for success in this model by providing feedback for each iteration of the project to allow for it to be improved for the final submission. And finally, they acquire student feedback throughout the semester. So I mentioned how I the journal. Being able to get the students' feedback on what's working well and what's challenging really allows me to be in tune to what additional instruction they may need. And even the students that don't tell me they're having those challenges might share them. So that's where I use the course announcement to really put out, here's some areas where students have concerns and here's some resources that can help address them. So getting that feedback allows you to act on it and improve the student learning. So I wanted to summarize now the different areas that we covered in this session. The first thing we talked about was backward design, where you start with identifying the outcomes for your project, then you select the assessment methods. What exactly will the project be for students? And then the last step is to figure out what learning strategies are needed to enable students to build that final project. The next thing we discussed was chunking, being able to look at what are some different components of this final project that I could have students work on throughout the course, remembering that the sooner you get them engaged, the more likely they are to continue that work throughout the course instead of doing that quick final project where everything's just thrown together. So the image I have here is the advanced version, where you have the topic, you have multiple parts, you have the draft and the final. But you might recall I said, at the very least, having them identify a topic early and doing a draft before the final can enhance the project significantly. And then the last image I have is a summary of the engagement and feedback strategies. Student to student through discussions, peer editing, and group work. Student to faculty through a reflection journal and one-on-one meetings. And then finally, faculty giving and engaging with students through that feedback and grading. I hope this session has given you some helpful ideas to think about how you can take these strategies and either create a new project or enhance a project that you already have. The bottom line is students benefit from the more ways you can engage with them and the more ways you can get feedback so that they're not learning in isolation, that they're really supported and able to take whatever they learn along the way to make the final project even better. If you have any questions, I encourage you to contact me, Dr. Peggy Rosario at rosariop@gmercyu.edu. And just another reminder, if you look at the physical PowerPoint handout attachment that I shared, if you click on the title of it at the beginning of the presentation, you can access the project worksheet. And throughout, there are hyperlinks to additional resources. Thanks again for being here. And Susan, I just noticed you joined me. Do you have any questions for me?
No, thank you. Hi.
I'm curious when you joined, because I was just doing this like a recording and I didn't
Yeah.
realize anyone was here. So which part did you join me?
So I think like many people, I've been hopping around from session to session
Mhm.
because there's so many things going on at
Yeah.
once. So I actually just joined, and you know what, I didn't even pay attention to time, but I think it's been within the last 10 minutes.
Okay, so you pretty
So
much saw my summary at the end to see what I had talked about
exactly,
earlier.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Why don't I just let me, why is that not working? Yeah, there we go. Let me just go through my slides really quick to see if there's anything you want to talk about. So here is the backward design model. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. So that makes complete sense for you in how designing instruction works well. Here's some resources that I shared related to that. This is a good page on learning outcomes as well as a learning outcome generator. And then some information on different assessment strategies and how they link to, how you can link those to instructional strategies.
Can you do me a favor? Will you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
So I'm all up for great suggestions about how to develop good student learning outcome statements. So if that's a resource you suggest, is that a hyperlink there?
It is. So I had sent the PowerPoint to the facilitator of the conference. So you should be able to access the PowerPoint, which reminds me, again, let me flip back here really quick.
I just dropped it in the chat. So Susan,
perfect.
if you could download it directly from the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is two really helpful resources that I found. I love the learning outcomes generator because it really forces you to think about what's important in creating those good outcomes.
Yeah, and thank you. I got that, so that will be super helpful.
Good.
But yeah, I think the more examples you can collect when you're working on the statements, I think it's so helpful. I think we're really struggling with that at my institution right now.
Yeah, it takes time to build. And in the instructional design course that I teach, a module on writing outcomes, and it's not easy. And I think a lot of institutions as well haven't really implemented best practices. They'll have outcomes that they sound very scholarly, but when you come right down to it, they're not measurable. So I think this is very practical and helpful.
Yes, and exactly. I want to develop something that, as you say, is easily measurable, because right, you can read these statements and they sound great, but how are you actually going to assess that? And yeah, again, it's a big struggle. So I appreciate any sort of good resources that people pass along.
Good. All right. That was helpful. And then classroom assessment, this has some very helpful tips on that. And this is nice too. So when you have your learning outcomes, and then you have, part of your learning outcome will be in relation to, right, a level of Bloom's taxonomy. So this actually gives you some suggestions for ways that you can teach students that enable them to meet those particular areas. So that it's a nice piece to go along with developing outcomes, is then how do you teach to enable students to successfully demonstrate learning in those areas. And then how about UDL? Are you familiar with that?
I am, but I'm happy to have you, just if you don't mind,
sure,
going through this again. I'm super happy to listen and look and learn.
Yeah. So I copied just the top of the chart that describes universal design for learning here, and basically different components that are important. One is to give students different ways that they can engage with the learning. So that would be developing interest, right? Help students understand why they need to learn what they're going to learn, right? And then the middle purple section is multiple means of representation. So this is basically what you're teaching, what the content is. And then finally, the multiple means of action and expression is the assessment. How are students demonstrating that learning? How, the how of learning. So when it comes to the multiple means, this is where you're thinking about, okay, beyond reading, are there visuals? Are there charts, graphs, videos, podcasts? Like the more things that you can identify up front to help students get the content, the more likely students will find something that resonates with them. And one of the things I love about that is then it prevents the need to reteach, right? Because if students already have so many different ways to learn the content, they're more likely to grasp it the first time. So that would be the idea of the representation. And then with action and expression, whenever you assess a student, you need to think, does the assessment I picked have to be done in one particular way? Or is there more than one way that a student could share their learning? So a great example of how I do this is in my discussion boards. A typical discussion board, you type your answer, right? I tell my students, you're welcome to type your answer, or you can make a video, or you can do a podcast, or you can do a PowerPoint. However they get the learning out there, it doesn't matter to me. The important thing is that they show what they've learned. And it's so interesting to me to see what they produce. Like the first time I had a student do a PowerPoint, I was like, oh my gosh, that was so easy to understand. And it's so wonderful for the students who enjoy doing that to be able to put it out there. It feels good. And they're doing the same learning as those that are writing up, a long dialogue.
Yeah, and I would just say, yes, I am totally open to that. And I love the concept too, because I think some people, it allows them to be very creative and present the work in a way that they're able to engage with it the best and understand it the best. And I just, why force somebody to present their work in this format if they can do it in another format that maybe I haven't even thought of that as a good choice, right? Somebody else might have a good idea. So I'm very open to having students share with me their ideas. So
Yeah,
yes.
I love that. Just adding that little on the end, or, suggest your own and then see what they come up with. And then the next time you teach the class, that can be one of the options that you add. It's beautiful when you can have that type of opportunity for students.
I mean, because really, if you're talking about getting students excited and really actively participating and like I said, engaged in their learning, giving them the option, okay, how would you like to share with me what you have learned? I'm totally open to it. So I think that's wonderful. Thank you for supporting that too.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, you're going back to the green section of engagement. You're exactly right. Students get excited if they pick their topic, if they're able to approach it in a way that makes meaning for them. It's the better for everybody. And for students to see each other approaching things in different ways, it makes the experience just so much more impactful for the students, for the peers, and for you as a teacher grading it, right? To be able to see something that the students put their heart and soul into because they're passionate about it. It's just really exciting.
Yeah, and I think too, if as you develop something like this, if you get into the idea of, okay, you're going to create a portfolio of your work throughout this course. And the portfolio should include a variety of presentations or demonstrating your knowledge in a variety of ways, because then that also sort of pushes people to get out of their comfort zone. Because if you say, okay, suggest your own idea, and then the student every single time is doing sort of the same sort of project or presentation, that's great. I see that they're really comfortable with that. They've really mastered that, and that's wonderful. Maybe that person can then take the lead on helping other students incorporate that into the work that they produce. But I think by the end of the class, if you say, okay, you need to have a portfolio that includes a minimum of 3 different types of presentations of your learning, something like that.
Yeah, I love that. Really important. And I think the other thing too is in certain classes, for example, if it's a writing class, they have to write, but in doing a presentation, you still have to write what you're going to say, right? So it's really exciting to see the different ways that students can show what they learned.
Exactly. Write a script and put it in a video, do a news broadcast of something, report what you have learned. I mean, exactly. There's still writing involved, but it doesn't have to be just an essay on paper or in a Word document or however. Put the information in a different format.
Yeah. All right. So then I just went through and shared some links between the book, What Inclusive Instruction Do, and the different strategies that I shared. So that can be something that you review. With the chunking content, I shared in the last screen that you would have seen the kind of the advanced approach, but the research paper approach is something that I've used very effectively, where you have them pick their topic, you have them do a lit review, then outline, draft, and final. But at the very basic level, I think having the students pick a topic early in the course and then do the draft before the final is due are 3 ways to get them engaged, get them some helpful feedback that can really help them make a stronger final project. Do you have any thinking about when you were interested in hearing this session?
Sorry, you cut out right when you said, do you have any?
Oh, sorry. I was just curious if you had a particular project in mind that you would like to think about maybe revamping a bit. Are there any ways you could chunk it differently?
I'm just always developing and helping to develop new projects. And so I don't have one in particular. I would say all of them. I'm always wanting to revamp, always wanting to make it better, reflect on, what worked well, what didn't, and how can we make this better moving forward. So yeah, not one, all of them.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is nice about thinking about chunking is when you notice that students are struggling with a particular aspect of a project, that's where you can pay more attention to, could we break it down a little bit more? Like, could there be 2 parts to help them build better skills in these particular areas where they get more feedback and it gives them a little bit stronger foundation to build the final. The idea behind chunking is you break it down, but then you think about, should it be broken down more?
I'm going to go with almost always. It needs to be broken down more.
Yeah.
Because just every single step, I think you present it, demonstrate it, you practice it together, give students an opportunity to practice it, with your support and then on their own. But doing it just once is never enough. Not even twice or it needs to be again and again and again, so that it really becomes something that they're comfortable with, is my experience. So yes, I think the smaller you make the chunks, the more success on each individual piece you have. But then the opposite to that is, if you break it down into lots and lots and lots and lots of little itty bitty pieces, that can also become overwhelming.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why I recommend start big and then target where you make it smaller. Yeah, because you don't want to start minutia because you will just go crazy. Start big and then refine it, I think, is the best approach there. Some more links to that. And then the engagement strategies. Did you join with this yet or no?
I did, no, I,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I just talked a little bit about how important it is for students to engage with each other. So through discussions, through peer editing, through group work, those are all wonderful strategies where they can talk about what they're doing and learn from each other. Depending on the level of students you're teaching, I teach doctoral students, so their ability to peer edit and work together in groups is pretty advanced. For novice students, they probably need a lot of scaffolding to learn how to help edit and work together in groups.
Yeah, my initial, as soon as I saw peer editing for, yes, the level of the student is very important. And I have never had success with peer editing in lower levels. Students, and I'm so sorry, that's my phone ringing, and I think I have to take this phone call. I'm so sorry.
Because we are at the end anyway, but I encourage you to go back and kind of review the session again, and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions for me. I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we had this sort of one-on-one. That was great. And I'm so sorry, I need to take this phone call.
All right, take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, with that, we will end the session. Thank you so much.